Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the crowd here, a number of partners, clients, and then a number of new faces. This is a really special moment for me because I'm actually originally from Andover, Massachusetts, and so I'm a native. So when the opportunity came up, we were talking about opening an office on the East Coast and looking at different options for it to be Massachusetts, and in the Boston area was certainly near and dear to my heart. It's just a really exciting time for us, and so thanks for coming out to share it with us. So just a little background for some of you on SDC. SDC was started in 2005. We're about 75 people now, 12 years old. We've done over 300 trials in a lot of different therapeutic areas, are continuing to grow and make momentum forward. You know, we focus in biostatistics and data management. We work on trying to do a dedicated service model that provides a high level of statistical consulting and data management expertise to work with our clients in a partnered consultative way. And so we really try to make an effort to care about what we do.
Who are you?
Dale, I'm the CEO of SDC, by the way. Richard Abelson. Sorry, didn't mean to introduce myself. And this is Dale Estner, President.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming out to this event this evening. I'm very grateful for you guys to come out and share this with us. SDC is very passionate about statistics and data management in clinical trials, and we're really hoping to engage in the community as we are here presenting very hopefully valuable topics and engagement in educational discussions on clinical trial topics from a data services angle. So thank you for that. I also want to reintroduce Faith Kolb, who's back there. Faith is she needs no introduction. Faith is our Vice President of Biometric Operations, and she is local to this area, has over 20 years of experience in clinical trials, and we are incredibly grateful to have her both running our operations as well as our shop here in Waltham. So, Faith, thank you very much. Jim Townsend will introduce the speakers.
We realized, since Dale's one of the speakers, that it would be awkward if he introduced the speaker, so I'll fill in for him. So we're obviously very fortunate tonight to have three very distinguished speakers here, and really excited that we've got such a great turnout. Hopefully these three won't mind me mentioning that combined it looks like it's over 75 years of industry experience sitting at that table, so definitely lots of experience to share. Our first speaker is Ken Getz. Ken's going to be speaking to us about trends in protocol design, practice, and optimization. Just a little background on Ken. He's the chairman of CIS-CRP, a nonprofit that he founded to educate and raise public and patient awareness of the clinical research enterprise. He's also the director of sponsored research and associate professor at Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development at the Tufts University School of Medicine, where he conducts research programs on drug development, management strategies and tactics, outsourcing, global investigative site and patient recruitment practices and policies. Ken was twice nominated as a Distinguished Faculty Award at Tufts. He's a well-known speaker at conferences, symposia, universities, investigative meetings, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware. Ken has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals, books, in the trade press. He holds a number of board appointments in the private and public sectors. He is currently a board member of WCG and Metrics Champion Consortium, and he's on the editorial board for Pharmaceutical Medicine and Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science. He also writes a bi-monthly column nominated for a Neal Award in Applied Clinical Trials. Ken's the founder of Center Watch, a leading publisher in the clinical trials industry. He holds an MBA from J.L. Kellogg Graduate School of Business, or Graduate School of Management at Northwestern, and a bachelor's from Brandeis University here locally. with that, I'll hand it over to Ken.
Thank you, Jim. I think that introduction took as long as my entire talk, so thank you. Thank you for that. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I want to thank SDC for the invitation to share in this celebration. And I sort of have the privilege of really setting the stage and sharing with you what many might find a little bit of a depressing topic, which is overall protocol design practice. But I threw optimization in the title because that's the hopeful part of my discussion. And I think you'll see that adaptive trial designs are probably one of the most promising areas where we are optimizing design, and it's really quite a growing area of interest among the pharmaceutical and biotech industry. All of the data that I'm going to share with you has been published in peer-reviewed journals. It's not data that we've compiled. It all comes from the companies themselves. All of the data has been coded by their own protocol authors, by their own clinical teams, which makes for an incredibly labor-intensive activity. But anytime I talk about the distribution of the practice areas, you should remind yourselves that these were coded and categorized by the companies themselves. They're actually reporting on their own practice. We have not done that for them. And I'm certainly happy to share any of these papers with you just to really give you a flavor for the variation by therapeutic area, by phase. I'm going to be kind of giving you a high-level overview of some of the most common design practices and the problems that we encounter as a result. I'm also going to do something that speakers are advised never to do, and that is to begin with all the takeaways and then get into the data and the insight behind it. But I've done one thing here. I've framed the punchlines as questions for you to get you thinking, so that will help a little bit. So I'm going to talk about design practices, and I'll characterize them for you. I'm then going to link our design practices to clinical trial performance. And as a rough rule, the more complex the protocol, the poorer we perform. And we have been able to demonstrate that time and time again. If you look at our cycle times, you look at our patient recruitment and retention rates, the cost of our studies, the success rates of our studies, they're all influenced by this fundamental roadmap that we established to essentially direct our clinical teams. And then I'll get into, after we go over the impact area, I'll quickly touch on some of the most promising optimization areas, and in some cases I'll even have some data to share with you showing some of the demonstrated areas of impact. So these are essentially the 5 questions that I'll use to frame the discussion. First, are you saying that protocol complexity is bad? And the quick answer is no. What we're saying is it's inevitable, and in fact it's actually rising, as you'll see in a minute. The real question is, how do we manage complexity more intelligently, more prudently? And what can we apply against that complexity to support the timelines that we've established and the critical efficiency requirements that we also have set in place for ourselves? Are regulatory agencies to blame for rising complexity? I'm often asked this question, and it depends on who you ask, right? If you ask the FDA, they'll point fingers at industry. If you ask industry, they'll point fingers back at the agencies. I would say, as a quick answer, there's plenty of blame to go around. And we'll leave it at that until I show you the data. Tell us what specific procedures to remove. I love that question because it's impossible for me to answer that. It depends on the endpoints and objectives of the study as defined by the clinical study report, and therefore the procedures that can be removed are only those that are protocol specific. They have to be determined by each individual protocol. Why does the Tufts Center believe that clinical trials are a waste of money? The first time I presented these findings, the next day there was a report in one of the trade journals with this as the title: the Tufts Center claims that trials are a waste of money. It's the first time I ever got a call from the dean of the medical school who wanted to know what I had said that would have triggered this. It's clearly not what we're saying. What we're trying to say is that the decisions that we make have within them some excessive or non-essential activities that actually drain and require resources that could be better spent elsewhere. And I'll talk about that in more detail.
Protocol amendments improve study design. Why do you recommend avoiding them? And the reason we do is because these are unplanned and unbudgeted. And when you aggregate all of the protocol amendments, which are remarkably disruptive, you realize that there are some that could have been avoided and would have represent substantial resource savings that could have been applied elsewhere. And so that's, again, part of the thinking here and the philosophy. How do we manage complexity and the byproduct of complexity more effectively? So let's look at some of the data, and these are all now aggregate average measures. I'm looking at 2 5-year periods where we have roughly 10,000 protocols that were evaluated in each of those observation periods, separated by 10 years. Total number of endpoints has nearly doubled, and I'll show you in a minute the distribution of the endpoints. Number of eligibility criteria has also risen by 60% or so. We often hear from investigative sites that they get protocols today where they believe they will not find a single patient in the community, perhaps not even on the planet, who will be eligible for the trial. Total number of procedures has also risen dramatically, and yet the number of visits and the duration of trials has actually not risen at a comparable rate, and therefore sites are performing more procedures on patients at every single visit. Total number of data points collected, that's an interesting one. We estimate that for our phase 3 pivotal trials, we're collecting nearly 1 million data points that have to be curated and cleaned. It's data that has to be managed and analyzed. So there's tremendous amount of resource and attention placed on the data alone. And then a couple of operating figures for you here. Total number of countries, as many of you know, has doubled, and the total number of investigative sites has also risen dramatically. Interestingly, the average number of patients per phase 3 protocol has actually gone down. We're actually engaging larger numbers of sites, spreading recruitment risk to each enroll a smaller number of patients, which makes good business sense, but in many respects it makes it more difficult for the site to ever achieve a level of scale and familiarity with the protocol when they're being asked to recruit 3 patients over an 11-month period. So it has the unintended consequence of making it very difficult for our sites to really efficiently conduct our studies. This is just looking at the change in our endpoints, and the good news is when you look at those time horizons that we typically still only see 1, maybe 2 primary endpoints and a comparable number roughly of key secondary endpoints. It's everything else that we're collecting, all the tertiary and exploratory and miscellaneous or supplementary secondary endpoints, and that's driven by so many factors. At the same time that we're looking to demonstrate safety and efficacy, we have so many more pressures on our protocols to demonstrate economic benefit, to gather more subjective assessments so that we can demonstrate clinically meaningful benefit as defined by the patient community. We're gathering more data on combination therapies and diagnostics that are now bundled or part of the therapy that we're evaluating. We also know that habit plays a big part. We still see many companies that will take a phase 2 protocol and just cut and paste that template into a phase 3 design and use that as the basis for the protocol design practice. And that is a behavior or a practice that is quite problematic. And also we see many companies second-guessing, anticipating what a regulatory agency or a health authority might request and baking that into the design of the study as well. So there is a real effort to mitigate and to anticipate these requests and essentially lower that sense of risk going into the conduct of the study. There are many, many other measures that I could share with you. I'll just highlight a few more, but again, it just gives you a flavor for the incredible growth that we've seen in complexity. We have 2 other measures that we use to just try to also understand burden. We have one measure called work effort, and it was adapted from the Medicare reimbursement as well as a value to the individual performing each procedure, and we found that the work effort to administer our procedures is growing at an even faster rate. So many of our procedures are even more labor intensive and require even more time. Many of our procedures are less expensive to implement today than they were in the past, like an ECG assessment, for example. But when you aggregate all of the procedures together and you think about the total cost per patient visit, the individual cost savings per procedure has not been enough to offset the incredible growth in the aggregate of the total cost to support the administration of every procedure in our protocol. So let's now relate the design characteristics to our performance, and as I mentioned to you, it's very, very intuitive, and there's a lot of data to support it, and I'll just touch on a few areas here. For one, we see that our recruitment and retention rates overall are the worst that they've been in our history as an industry, and we find in general when we compare the cycle times for high complexity protocols to low complexity protocols that the more complex protocols have substantially longer overall cycle times. Interestingly, that startup cycle time from protocol readiness to first patient first visit is only modestly different. And that's because our sites typically race to get that first patient in the study. It's the downstream impact of complexity where you start to see the challenge of patient retention really come into play. And that's why we almost see a doubling in the cycle time when we compare our most complex to our least complex protocols. We can relate that even further to some of the classic recruitment durations that we're measuring today. Across every therapeutic area, the planned duration of the typical clinical trial has to be doubled in order to achieve the target enrollment rate, which is absolutely remarkable today. It could be a function of poor planning, that we set very aggressive timelines that we have no hope of achieving, but we believe the complexity of our protocols is playing a role here as well. And on the right-hand side, you see a very common pattern in any large phase 3 multi-center study. Even after doubling the planned enrollment period, 10% of our sites will fail to enroll a single patient. And about 40% of our sites will under-enroll, and that's our most expensive group because now we have to monitor them. They've been activated, and so they're now, they have to be managed. And so that is really a major challenge for our industry. You may not know this, but the number of complaints filed against investigators and investigative sites for noncompliance and fraud has increased dramatically during the 2000s, really starting around 2005. In 1999 and 2000, the average number of complaints that the FDA received was 10. And we saw a tenfold increase for a variety of reasons. One, the FDA launched a toll-free number. The FDA also offered the opportunity to file a complaint anonymously online. It was also a time when Jesse Gelsinger and Ellen Roche, and there were a few other very tragic patient deaths that really created heightened sensitivity to reporting any perceived noncompliance or fraud, and that has really continued to rise, and it's stabilized around the 250 complaints a year level. The number one area of complaints is protocol noncompliance. I mentioned to you just how disruptive protocol amendments are. We see a very strong relationship between complexity and the number of amendments. The typical phase 3 protocol has 2.3 amendments. It costs about $500,000 to implement a single amendment and requires about 3 months of time to take back or suspend the study, to take back the protocol, to revise it, to approve it internally, to resubmit it to the IRB, and ultimately to reconsent our study volunteers. If we aggregate the total cost of amendments, we're looking at about $6 to $7 billion a year, unplanned, spent just to implement our protocol amendments, which is just a remarkable number. And here's the part that depresses people the most. A high percentage of amendments are implemented before the first patient has even received the first dose, which is a clear indication that we're not spending time challenging and testing and refining the feasibility of our protocols before we implement them. The number one reason for amending is to relax our eligibility criteria. So I've now shared with you some of the characteristics of protocol design practice. I've connected the dots a bit to talk about its impact on protocol or clinical trial performance, let's look at some of the optimization areas, and there are quite a few. One area where we see a lot of focus today is on the protocol authoring process itself, and there are many places that we can look for insight. These are just two that I'm listing here. One is the SPIRIT checklist, which you can freely download. It's available online. And it was created by a community of global medical writers, protocol authoring experts. Transcelerate now has a common protocol authoring template. And they basically apply the same principle, which is to create a direct connection or a line of sight between each procedure and the endpoint that it supports. And if it's not a primary or key secondary endpoint, if it's not required for regulatory compliance or a baseline assessment, then it suggests challenging whether that is a procedure that should be administered, if it can be administered a smaller number of times, or even delayed for perhaps a post-marketing study. So that's the basic principle behind these authoring templates, and a number of organizations are using them quite actively today. We also see a number of organizations, large and mid-sized pharma companies, that have implemented feasibility review committees that actually challenge a pre-approved protocol with an eye toward improving its feasibility, the ability to administer it more easily and conveniently. And many of these feasibility communities are 10, 15 years old at this point. It really depends on the culture of the company. We find that German companies, for example, call them feasibility challenge committees, whereas American and British companies often call them feasibility facilitation committees, and I'll let you think through the cultural differences there. Another way that we challenge feasibility is by actually soliciting patient input, and we see a growing number of companies now using patient advisory boards. These are patients who are not actually participating in the study, and they're given the protocol before it's been finalized, and they typically offer insights into the schedule of assessments and what it might be like, the burden of participation from their perspective. And so these are proving to be quite inexpensive to implement and quite valuable in terms of the insights that they offer protocol design professionals. I mentioned adaptive designs, and we're going to really get into that in a lot more detail. This has been a very, very promising area. It took a while to really get traction in the marketplace, and we started tracking adoption around 2012. We estimate that we may be looking at 40 to 50% of major and mid-sized companies now that are using some form of simple adaptation. It might be sample size re-estimation or early termination due to safety or efficacy futility. And there are a number of other adaptations that are becoming more commonly used today. Here, the definition of an adaptive design, and I think we'll get into this in more detail, is really to have pre-planned changes that have already been approved, pre-planned changes to the protocol, and while the study is underway, to, during the interim phases, review the data and actually make adjustments to the design of the protocol while the study is underway. We're starting to see a lot more momentum in the adaptive design space. The regulatory agencies are becoming far more receptive to design, and they believe it offers a lot of promise in terms of even improving success rates. And we also know that the 21st Centuries Act is really now requiring the FDA to issue more detailed guidance, which we think will create more regulatory wins to drive adaptive designs into more mainstream. We're seeing now also a lot of organic growth, the belief that a lot of our randomized controlled trials really will respond well to some of the adaptive design approaches. And we also see new applications, many of them associated with a lot of the new types of trials that are becoming more popular, many that really target very, very specific and stratified patient subpopulations, very costly studies that are targeting rare diseases where we really need to make sure that every cohort in our studies counts. So adaptive designs really help to channel and focus a lot of our resources as well. So I leave you again with the key concepts, and I also encourage you to send me a note if you'd like to receive any copies of these papers. Are we saying that protocol complexity is bad? No. Again, we believe that complexity will continue to rise. It's all about managing complexity and having more of a management and mitigation mindset. Are agencies to blame? We think that a lot of the blame really can be directed at the protocol authors themselves, but the good news is that there are many opportunities to impact and improve and optimize protocol design. When we can point the blame, we can also identify so many places where there are opportunities for practice improvement. And we've identified a number of opportunities targeting those non-core procedures, as well as avoidable amendments as critical places where there could be substantial resource savings that could really be better applied to other programs in our portfolios. So I thank you again for the opportunity to share in the celebration. Jim, do we have time for a couple questions?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that up front. We will take a few limited amount of questions now, and then we'll have an extended Q&A during the panel after all three speakers are finished.
So this is the time for core questions, not non-core.
Right.
And I'll also suggest that if you have any of the non-core questions, that it's fair game for the other panel members.
Very good presentation, Ken. I'm just wondering, in terms of the protocol amendment, do you have data by therapeutic area or major?
Yes.
Okay, so is there any, because I would be surprised if oncology would be, I will not be surprised if oncology will have more amendments versus a more established therapeutic area like the cardiovascular and metabolism.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Oncology is really quite an anomaly. They're typically one of the most complex disease conditions, and we see a much higher relative number of amendments, particularly in later stage studies.
So is the complexity more about therapeutic area?
It depends, again, on who you ask, because specialists in any disease condition can point to their own design practices and identify places where they're conducting procedures excessively, when there's a growing number of non-core activities. But if you were a company that had a diverse portfolio, you could earmark some of the most complex therapeutic areas as a place to start, and others could be sort of left for a later time period.
Ken, you mentioned that the number of patients per trial has gone down. Do you think that's a function of companies moving away from primary care more towards orphan and specialty care? Is that,
yeah,
do you have data for that?
We think it's two factors. One is what you're describing, that there is movement towards specialty and rare diseases, which have much smaller numbers of patients, clearly. The other is that if you look at the number and types of companies today that are funding drug development activity, we've seen a huge shift away from major pharma, and we see lots of smaller companies that are targeting some of these specialty and rare diseases and also have more limited resources. And so they're trying to power their studies with a smaller number of patients as well. So those are really sort of the two factors that are quite prevalent. Today, major pharma is only sponsoring around 38 to 40% of all drugs in development, which is unheard of. Well, great. I look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Jim.